Hello and welcome to this evening's webinar, A Future for Wetlands, the Mosses and Marshes project. It's hosted by CIWEM, the Chartered Institution for Water and Environmental Management. My name is Stefan Fiedelschuster. I'm currently serving as Vice Chair of the West Midlands branch and Chair of the West Midlands New Members Group. I'm very excited to introduce today's event to you, and we've got some outstanding speakers and a really fascinating topic to discuss. The topic of a future for wetlands is more relevant than ever in the wake of CIWEM's declaration of a climate emergency and in the lead up to COP26. The West Midlands branch are hosting this event in collaboration with the CIWEM Arts and Environment Network, which provides a community of practice to put more creativity at the heart of environmental policy and action. Since 2007, the network has generated events, publications, and input to national policy to highlight the links between the environment and the arts. It also hosts the annual Nick Reeves Award in honour of CIWEM's former executive director. This webinar is also hosted in collaboration with the Ramsar Culture Network of the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. This network is a voluntary global community of practice to promote understanding and action on the relationship between wetland ecosystems and human culture. If you'd like to know more about CIWEM, the Arts Environment Network, or the Ramsar Culture Network, we'll be sharing links in the chat during the presentations that you can follow. Now, in a moment, I'm going to hand over to our presenters. Firstly, you'll hear from Robert Duff about the Marches Mosses BogLIFE project, an EU-funded peatland conservation project. Robert's background is as an ecologist and a conservationist, and he's worked for Natural England for 30 years, mainly with a focus on wetlands. And over the last 15 years, he's made great contributions to securing funding for the conservation of the Meres and Mosses landscape, encompassing 200 sites across Cheshire, Shropshire, and Staffordshire. This presentation will focus on the Fenns and Whixall Mosses, which is the largest of those sites. Next, you'll hear from Andrew Howe about the Mosses and Marshes project. Andrew is the lead artist for the project in the UK, which he started in collaboration with Australia-based artist Kim Goldsmith. He likes to explore landscapes to find layers of history and meaning, and he is a firm believer in the value of artists taking on roles at the heart of collaborative, environmentally and socially engaged projects. Andrew is a long-standing member of CIWEM with over 35 years experience as a chartered civil engineer, an environmental consultancy, and works as a technical director with Frith Resource Management. I'm also joined on the panel by Dave Pritchard, who will lead the Q&A session and will pick up your questions over the course of the webinar. So please do submit them in the Q&A section rather than the chat. Dave has spent 30 years in nature conservation policy, law, and science before working internationally as an independent consultant in environment, culture, heritage, and the arts. If you think that sounds like an unusual mix, then you're right, because Dave is quite possibly the only person to have ever been employed simultaneously by the UN Environment Programme and the Arts Council in England, championing the intersection of those seemingly disparate disciplines. He also coordinates the Ramsar Culture Network, is an honorary fellow of CIWEM, and chairs the Arts Environment Network. So I think you'll agree that we have some very exciting presenters tonight, so I won't hold us up any longer and hand over to our first speaker, Robert. Please take it away.
Okay, thank you, Stefan. Great. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. So I'll just get my first slide. Right, there we go. Right, hello everyone. So I'm going to tell you about the Marches Mosses BogLIFE project. And that is a project that is focused on a site, but the site, which is called Fenns, Whixall and Bettisfield Mosses, lies within a much broader wetland landscape known as the Meres and Mosses. Now, some people are aware of the Meres and Mosses, but others may not be. It's basically a post-glacial landscape that covers the land south of the Mersey all the way down to Shrewsbury and Shropshire, and extends all the way to the east towards Stoke and Newcastle under Lyme. And within that sort of post-glacial landscape, there are about 200 or so natural wetlands, as Stefan mentioned, and it's a really important lowland wetland landscape, which has a huge diversity of wetland types. And although the talk today is called Mosses and Marshes, an important component of this wetland landscape is the meres as well, natural lakes. And so I just wanted to provide that context before I start talking about this individual site called Fenn's, Whixall and Bettisfield Mosses, which is the jewel in the crown of this landscape. So Marches Mosses, as I say, it's an ancient landscape on the border with Wales, and it lies about 5 miles north of Wem in North Shropshire, and about 10 miles from Wrexham. And the actual Welsh border runs through the through the middle of the site, with 2/3 of it being in England and 2/3 of it lying in Wales and 1/3 in England. It is one of the most important wetland sites in the United Kingdom, in that it's an example of a lowland raised bog, which is a rare habitat, and it's the 3rd largest of its type left in the UK. It's huge in that it covers 1,000 hectares, and is probably one of the largest inland wildernesses in England, in lowland Britain, that we have. It's made up of deep peat soils, has a large store of carbon. We estimate it between 1 and 2 million tons of carbon is locked up in that peat deposit. So incredibly important as a carbon store. And I think you know, the next speaker is going to cover this a bit much more, but it has a rich history and cultural heritage that Andrew will touch on, and I'm not going to really touch on this during my talk. I'm going to tell you about the project and the actions that we're undertaking on the site. So the project is an ambitious £5 million partnership project between Natural England, Shropshire Wildlife Trust and Natural Resources Wales. And the aim of the project is to remedy the severe damage done to this unique peatlands ecosystem through historic damage, etc. It's funded primarily from the EU's LIFE fund, an instrument that is dedicated towards restoration of sites which have special area of conservation status. These are the sites of European importance. This site is also a Ramsar site, and mention of Ramsar was made earlier, meaning that it's also of international importance under the Ramsar Treaty. Now, the project, this site, the Marches Mosses, Fenns, Whixall and Bettisfield Mosses, has been under restoration starting in 1990, when the site was acquired as a nature reserve. So there's a history of restoration for the past 25 years, but that was pretty much done on a shoestring. And so this injection of European funds has enabled us to have a go at a second fix and a step change in the progressive restoration of this site. The significant thing to say is, whilst this is an incredibly important site, it has been severely damaged historically. So trying to restore it towards a functioning lowland raised bog is a very challenging task. Right. So just before we get into some of that detail, I thought it's worth just highlighting again the incredible importance of peatlands as a planetary ecosystem. Peatlands cover just 3% of the Earth's surface, yet they contain 30% of all organic carbon on the planet. And on a global scale, that's twice the carbon in all the world's trees. And unfortunately, 94% of the UK lowland peat bogs have been destroyed. But it makes it so much more important that we conserve the remaining peatlands that we have. I mean, the reason why peatlands are so incredible at storing peat, it's storing carbon compared to trees, is that trees basically lock up the carbon while they're alive. So what you have in the tree stems, the roots, and the canopy, and sprinkled across an area, whereas a peat bog, you have the carbon in the surface living vegetation, but you also, because peatlands pickle the dead vegetation over millennia, you've got 8,000 years worth of stored carbon in a unit area. That's why peat bogs are such an incredible carbon store. But the primary reason for conserving the Fenns, Whixall and Bettisfield mosses is related to its importance for nature conservation. And as I said, lowland raised bogs are an important endangered ecosystem, and they support very specialist vegetation and fauna community, very specialist species that depend on the particular environment that you get on bogs, which tend to be obviously very wet, acidic and low nutrient environment. And the sorts of species that we have 13 species of sphagnum moss, or bog moss, and sphagnum moss is the keystone species of a bog. It creates that nutrient low environment and the acidic environment through its particular properties. At Fenns and Whixall, we also have some really scarce species like Dicranum undulatum, that sort of moss on the top right hand side. It's the only location south of Cumbria where this species still occurs, and it's the only location in Wales where it occurs. We've got the white-faced darter dragonfly, a bog pool specialist dragonfly, which only occurs in 5 sites in England. We've got very rare spiders, the jumping spiders, which are sort of live in and amongst the sphagnum moss, very much adapted towards that environment. And because of the low nutrient status, we get carnivorous plants such as the sundew. And the site is a particular stronghold for the large heath butterfly, which depends on the hare's tail cotton grass, we have a very healthy population at the site. But as I mentioned, it was severely damaged, and just to touch on the history of that damage, primarily it's through drainage, and increasingly in the 20th century, the site was exploited, and in the late 80s, there was going to be a major increase in the commercial exploitation of the moss for peat cutting, and that led to a campaign which led to the site being rescued and acquired by the then Nature Conservancy Council as a nature reserve. Now, just to look at this landscape again is to appreciate some of the key pressures on it at the moment. And from this photograph, you can see that the drainage, how it's been extensively drained, and they estimate there's a cut drain every 10 meters across this peatland, the legacy of peat cutting. It was also impacted by the cutting of a railway across part of the bog, and also on the English side there was a canal that was cut through the edge of the site, and progressively it was affected by encroachment by farming in the 18th and 19th century, and later in the 1960s onwards it's been affected by plantation forestry planting. So it has quite a lot of pressures on it. So I mentioned woodland, the conifer plantation, and one of the other major pressures, which I'm going to touch on in some of the actions that we're trying to undertake to address it, is pollution, both from the air and water, and I'll come back to both of those. So just a little bit a simplistic coverage of the topography of the site. So this gives you a sort of idealized topographic form of a lowland raised bog, a pristine bog. So it should be a sort of blancmange where the accumulation of dead plants over thousands of years leads to a surface of the vegetation rising above the surrounding mineral ground, and you get this nice dome with a groundwater table, such that you have an independent hydrology which is just dependent on rainfall, so clean water, low nutrient rainfall. But what we've got at Fenn's and Whixall Mosses, as a result of the commercial exploitation and the commercial cutting of peat, etc., is this very damaged topography. So it's a huge challenge, really, to because the topography has been so disrupted. It's fixing this hydrology to get the bog functioning is a complex and not a straightforward enterprise. It's really a bit of a case of Humpty Dumpty. So now, just going to look at some of the project actions that we're undertaking to try and move the site forward in terms of restoration. So a key action in our project is about acquiring more of the bog. At the moment, Natural England and Natural Resources Wales manages about 660 hectares of the site, so about 2/3. And through the project, which started 4 years ago in 2016, one of our key actions has been about expanding the National Nature Reserve, and we've managed to acquire 100 hectares to date of extra land. Now you can the history of the ownership of the bog is that it was during the enclosures in the early 1800s, and it was split between many different land ownerships, although there was a couple of large landowners. So it's a bit like a jigsaw, trying to acquire little bits of land that's been split between many landowners. The reason why we wanted to try and acquire more of the bog is to basically, in the long term, we can achieve better boggy conditions if we have more of the area, and it's we can manage the bog also as more as a ecosystem as a whole, and improve its function. It's quite difficult managing areas if you've got one area that's restored, but the adjacent area, the water levels have been managed at a much lower level. So let's have a look at an example of some of the land that we've acquired. So looking at Whixall Moss, which is the English side, pretty much all of the land that you can see north of the canal. Can you see the canal on the north side with the wooded areas? Pretty much all of that block of land has been acquired since the project started, and that includes that sort of hardcore area that you can see in the middle, which is a former scrapyard, which I'll tell you a bit more about that later. Also part of the land acquired has been a lot of edge land, so it also includes the wetland pool that you can see in the foreground, and this area illustrates an area that has really been affected by both drainage but also oxidation and peat, so that the peat level, the peat is wasted away, and the ground has sunk and subsided, meaning that areas that were 20, 30 years ago managed as pasture have naturally just become so low that they've just naturally become wetter. One of the key aspects of the Marches Mosses BogLIFE project is about trying to start to restore the edges of this bog. As I mentioned, during the first 25 years, the focus was on restoring the middle core area. And the challenges with restoring the edges of the bog are much greater, in the sense that you need to work very carefully with all the neighbouring land uses. So it's also worth pointing out in this photograph that on the right-hand side, you'll see one or two areas of pasture. And I just mentioned that because I'm going to, with one of our actions is about whether we can restore pasture back to bog. So here's the scrapyard. So bless them, Shropshire Wildlife Trust, one of our key partners, decided to take on the challenge of acquiring a scrapyard in order to make sure that this area wasn't bought up and developed in some other way. The scrapyard was created about, started up in the 1960s. I think there was very little regulation about it at that time, and just managed to expand. And it's all built on deep peat, and it's probably not a best practice example of scrapyard creation. The owner of the site went bust in about 2015, and the Wildlife Trust, as part of this project, managed to buy the site for the princely sum of £10, on the basis that the project would be able to help with the cleanup. So one of the key actions of the project has been about trying to clean up this site and do some level of remediation. So in 2018, we got a specialist firm in to undertake the restoration site clearance of the site. And I'm just going to show, hopefully this will work, a little video showing you what the site is like now. But during the cleanup, there was 70,000 tyres were removed from site, 409 tonnes in total, 27 tonnes of asbestos taken off site, 700 tonnes of scrap metal, and the demolition of 5 5 buildings. So that was quite a new action for both the Wildlife Trust and Natural England to contemplate, but it's gone reasonably well. So what's the future now that we've cleared the site? So what we want to do is rewild it. We've taken advice. We've had a remediation plan that's been agreed with the local authority, and we've taken advice from the Environment Agency, and it's a bit of a Pandora's box site. So the aim is, so the advice is not to try and remove the deposits, the subsurface deposits. So the recommendation is that we just provide a cover on top of it and allow it to rewild. So we're going to, one of the actions that we've undertaken is to place some, oh, sorry about that. Hold on, let's move on. So one of the actions has been to, though, that field that I mentioned with pasture, where we're trying to revert pasture to bog, we've taken off the turf and we've transported it over to the scrapyard to provide a natural cover of about 40 centimetres of turf on top of the scrapyard, and it'll be allowed to go back to wet woodland. Which then nicely brings us into the trials that we're undertaking to see if we can convert pasture to bog. So we're basically taking, as I've mentioned, stripping off 40 centimetres of the pasture soil off the top, and fitting, undertaking bunding and pipes to try and carefully manage the water table so that we can get the water table that we need for bog communities to establish. So what we're looking for is something within 10 centimetres of the surface. And then the next step in this action involves planting beader hummock and beader gel, which are micro-propagated sphagnum moss, which has been collected from Fenns and Whixall mosses, taken to a site in Leicestershire, and then micro-propagated in a sort of laboratory conditions, and then bulked up, and then returned to the site to be planted. So we've got 130,000 plugs of sphagnum that we're planting across 3 hectares as part of a trial. And the difference between beader hummock and beader gel, beader hummock is like the sphagnum that you can see, little plugs, whereas beader gel is like a soup of sphagnum, little cut up heads of sphagnum in a soup, which is then sprayed like Ghostbusters onto the land. And then finally, after we've planted the sphagnum moss on the site, we put a protective mulch on there to help protect it from drying out too much. So it's early days, but we'll see how those trials go. Right, so this is a photograph from an ecologist and an excellent photographer, Stephen Barlow, of the middle of the Fenns and Whixall mosses, and you know it's a lovely landscape shot of the, it looks like a British savanna, really, a true wilderness, but there are indicators of poor health here, and an ecosystem out of balance. So the yellow grass that you can see, known locally as iron grass, is called purple moor, is also called purple moor grass, and it's become overwhelmingly dominant on our site at the expense of some of our specialist bog species. And the reason for this, we think, is an invisible influence affecting the ecology of the site, namely airborne deposition of nitrogen, and in particular nitrogen in the form of airborne ammonia. So this is ideally what we would like to see, is basically a bog moss rich vegetation community, but instead we're getting that purple moor grass covering large areas of the site. And the site, Fenns and Whixall, is included as part of the national ammonia monitoring network that CEH undertake. So we've got 25 years of ammonia monitoring data for the site. And we've been doing quite a lot of analysis of this and modeling over recent years. And essentially the site is receiving high depositions of ammonia and nitrogen. It's probably 3 times over the ecological threshold that this nutrient poor habitat can tolerate. And the analysis that we've undertaken is showing that actually most of this aerial ammonia is coming from very local sources, probably within 5 kilometers of the site. So the modeling we've done is showing that a lot of it's coming from agricultural, the dairy and cattle enterprises around the site, and also sort of poultry enterprises. And this is impacting significantly on the vegetation community that we're getting, particularly for vascular plants and lower plants. So some of the changes that we're seeing in our higher plant communities through eutrophication and new acidification are increases in cotton grass, as a overdominance of purple moor grass replacing sphagnum moss, and over-representation of some of our bog species like bog rosemary and cranberry. So, one of the very interesting things is that there's a bit of research that's been undertaken in Sweden showing that where you get high nitrogen deposition, it can actually make your carnivorous plants, which should naturally be eating lots of bugs, become vegetarian and stop eating the insects, etc. So very subtle ecological impacts that we're being affected by. So that's a problem that I've described. So what are we doing under the project as part of that? Well, as I've mentioned, we're doing lots of work to model it and identify where the sources are. And we want to undertake a site nitrogen action plan, working with other players dealing with ammonia in the local and regional context, including the landowners if possible. But on site itself, we're undertaking as part of the project a control, sort of purple moor grass control trials. And so in about 6 areas across the site, we're undertaking different management regimes to see how that affects the dominance of Molinia in different areas. So in some areas we're cutting, in other areas we're undertaking weed wiping. So where you apply a glyphosate to just kill off the Molinia grass itself, but it doesn't get into the thatch below. And then in some other areas we've been scraping the Molinia away. And in combination, in all those areas, we're undertaking re-wetting works through bunding, which I'll describe in a few minutes. The results so far is that this kind of technique is very time-consuming and difficult to carry out practically. Because of the topography and getting machinery in place, etc. And it's not really practical at a large scale. And that the results so far show that the best thing that we can do to try and manage that Molinia, stop that over dominance and millennia is to tackle the water table. Right, so how are we increasing the wetness of the site? So the key the key to increasing the wetness is about trying to deal with the surface peat, which is degraded and quite permeable. And what we found is that that where peat has been partially drained out, you get a chemical change to that peat, and you get a lot of it becomes more permeable, and you get a lot of lateral flow, which sheds the rainwater that falls. So rather than it being captured on the site. So to restore water levels, we're undertaking a huge program of what we call contour and cell peat bunding, with the aim of trying to form a ring around the core of the site, which is already wet. It's a technique that was sort of developed in Cumbria as part of a life project that they had up there on the Cumbrian bogs. And essentially what it involves is creating small cells about 20 meters by 20 meters or 30 meters by 30 meters, where you repack the surface of the peat to bring up very wet peat, the more impermeable peat, which you find deep down, which has always been saturated, and bring that to the surface to form kind of curbstone. So let's have a look at that in action. So over the past 3 years, we've had a contractor called Dinsdale Moorland Services on site, and they've been carrying out this peat bunding on our behalf. And what they do is basically take off the what we call degraded topsoil and repack it, and it breaks down any peat pipes and such like, and just creates this sort of impermeable curbstone of peat, which then allows sort of paddy cells effectively to be created. And this is the result, very effective. You can see the pattern of peat cells that have been created, and how effective they are at holding the rainwater, which prior to this bunding would have really just shed off towards the nearest drains across an area. So we're looking to do about 300 hectares of this type of bunding as a restoration technique on the site. So one of our other key actions is about restoring woodland back to bog, and I mentioned commercial plantations. On the north side of the site, as part of the project, we've undertaken the reversion of 50 hectares of plantation to bog. So what that has involved is clear felling 50 hectares of plantations that were established in the 1960s. As this land was in Wales, NRW have undertaken this action on behalf of the project. And once that trees were harvested, and then we could get in to undertake the peat bunding that I mentioned. And this is a shot of a recent shot of the forest areas after bunding work, and you can see how it's holding water once again, and hopefully very quickly this area will develop into a bog community, like the next slide, where after a couple of years we have we hope we will see a restored bog vegetation community starting to establish. So the results are, hopefully it'll be wetter and better, and better for wildlife. So that's about a key action of bunding, but how do we know it's working? Well, we've recently had a hydrological analysis report carried out independently by Sam Leader from Birmingham University. And she's carried out an analysis of 30 years of hydrological data. Now, I haven't got time to go through that, but I just wanted to touch on some of the highlights from that report very quickly. And what she's been able to show is we've been monitoring the amount of water coming off the moss, and she's found that the volumes of water leaving the moss have significantly reduced over the years as a result, following the restoration work that we've been carrying out. So, you know, effectively, we can prove that we are slowing the flow and holding more water on site, which is obviously good for downstream areas. And it's great that we're holding more water through the summertime and getting less drought conditions. One area that we've particularly looked at is Bettisfield moss, and I'm going to the next slide. I'm going to focus on that, and there we found that the water levels are significantly higher than previous years following the bunding, and that our dip wells are showing an increase of up to 35 centimetres. Following the bunding work, and that the periods when we're getting wet conditions are significantly improved as a result of the restoration. And this slide here again also referring to Bettisfield moss, sort of graphically shows you some of those changes. So if you look at the colours, the navy blue indicates where the water table is up to 100% of time was wetter than the target level. So that's where we're getting areas maybe slightly too wet. The grey areas indicate where it's too dry, so we don't want the grey areas. And the turquoise indicates, you know, the sweet spot there where we're getting our target water levels, which is within 10 centimetres of the ground surface. So if you look at the timeline at the top, you've got 2016, where you can see the turquoise area is quite small in 2017, a little bit bigger in 2018 following the bunding work, and then significant improvements in 2019, showing that we're hitting more towards our target levels. Obviously, it does depend on the rainfall conditions in each of the years, but definitely things are moving in the right direction. Just a few more slides, and then I'll finish off. So, one of our big actions on the site involves a bit of replumbing. Trying to divert some of the drains that were put through in the 18th century when the enclosures were undertaken, and one of the large drains that was cut across the peat to get water away from a mineral catchment next to the moss was an area called the Bronnington Manor Drain on the north side of the site. And as part of the project over the winter, we've been creating a new channel to divert that drain back to the edge of the bog rather than it crossing the moss. So it's been work that's been underway over the last few months, during this very wet period. I'm glad to say that the work is just recently completed, and the now new drainage diversion channel is open. And the benefit of that is that allows us then to restore the areas either side of the old Bronnington Manor Drain, so the peatland, which we couldn't restore before because the mineral-rich and nutrient-rich water would have flooded onto the moss. So it allows us to restore peatland either side. And this is another picture of the recent works. And I just want to finish off, this is my penultimate slide really, by with a view from an eye in the sky. So this is some recent infrared images taken by the European Space Agency Sentinel satellite. So the one you're seeing now is the one taken in 2017. And what I've highlighted there is the, sorry, go back. So, what I've highlighted there is the area of forest that we've reverted back to bog, and that's in the blue circle. And in the green circle is an area where there's been extensive bunding in the last year. So this is before work started on those areas, and then you can see the changes hopefully within those two marked off areas. So you can see the forest areas have been cleared, and if you look at the black areas that are showing, those are showing sort of where the water is starting to accumulate. So they are, they will re-wet very effectively. And looking in the green area, hopefully you can see again, you can see all the little black marks across that landscape, and that notes the re-wetting of those areas. So those cells are holding water. So thank you. Thank you. That's the end of my slides, and I will hand over. I'll stop sharing.
Excellent. So I think it's for me now to say hello to everyone. I'm Dave Pritchard, and thank you very much indeed, Robert. A fascinating insight into this amazing place and the work that's being done towards really positive things for the future. I think we're going to go into questions and discussion after we've heard from both you and Andrew. So we won't really open it up at this stage yet, unless there's anything that needs a quick factual clarification. Just for those who aren't familiar, though, do you maybe want to explain quickly that the Marches is not the same thing as the Marshes, in case anybody's wondering about
that? Yes, that's right. The Marches is a title that we gave to the project. The Marches being the sort of Welsh English marches, so the Marches Barons of Pass. So it's more to denote the geographical area rather than the marshes. Yeah, so it's a bit confusing. Marshes, marches, and mosses.
Great. And just two other things. I'm looking at the Q&A. Two other quick things you can probably answer now. One is it possible for individuals to become involved in the BogLIFE project as volunteers? And is your restoration strategy publicly available?
Absolutely, we have a volunteering program, and I didn't have a chance really during this talk to tell you about all the engagement work that we are doing with local community and public engagement work. But we have a active volunteer group that meets every Thursday. So by all means, contact the project. We've got a website, so give us a, get in contact and we'll respond to you. In terms of the strategy, we have a website. It's the best place to get more information about the project. So if you put in Meadows and Mosses into Google, you get through to the Marches Mosses BogLIFE site.
Great, thank you. There are some other interesting questions coming through about things like climate change and the air pollution aspect, but I think we'll come back to those when we've heard from you both. So if it's okay with you, Andrew, I'll pass straight to you now, if you're able to launch your slides and take us into your presentation.
Okay, and I just want to share sound. I'll work out how to do that. That's okay, it's sharing sound. Oops, has it gone back to the middle? Okay, right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Robert. That's a fascinating talk. Hopefully it's provoking some discussion. I'm conscious that we are short on time now, so I'll just stick to my script and not try and go off on tangents. I'm going to start with a review, a bit of background about my work as an artist and how I came to be involved with wetland landscapes. I'll talk briefly about how the arts and science can work together with a few case studies specific to wetlands. Probably haven't got much time to talk about those in detail now, but the main part of my talk will cover the Mosses and Marshes project, its connections with Kim Goldsmith in Australia, with other artists in the UK, and with Natural England and Shropshire Wildlife Trust at the Mosses. I'll touch on some of the key themes of the art project, leading into how we might reimagine a future for wetlands. So I'm speaking here today as a visual artist, but as Stefan said, I've been a member of SciWem for almost 30 years. My professional origins began with a degree in engineering science. I've worked as a chartered civil engineer in environmental consultancy on a wide range of different infrastructure and environmental projects, water management, wastewater treatment, and contaminated land remediation. And then for most of the last 20 years, I've been a specialist advisor in waste and resource management, currently with Fritz Resource Management. And then alongside this, I gained a second degree in creative arts and built an artist practice with self-initiated projects and over time, socially engaged projects, collaborating with other artists and community groups. And so I'm a walking artist, whereby through walking landscapes, I researched layers in history and look for hidden narratives that I can then engage people with through producing artwork in paintings, photography, film, sound, prints, and books. And whilst you might see fundamental differences between these two practices, there are also many common interests and driving forces around understanding places and how people interact with them. And what scientists and artists do all day can appear very similar, for me anyway. There's all too little time actually spent in the studio making art. So it's important to me that my work has some social purpose, even if that work is now more about raising awareness and provoking discussion on social and environmental issues than more tangible delivery of stuff on the ground. Situations are rarely totally black and white. So just as in engineering projects, when it's often necessary to use judgment based on limited scientific evidence and proven experience, I use artistic judgment to make responses to places that have multiple and complex stories. I believe that communities become more resilient and caring when people have the confidence, understanding, and skills to engage actively with the world around them. And artists help to nurture curiosity and hold a space for people to take a close look at things. Of course, artist practices are extremely diverse, many different ways of working and looking at the world. And there are plenty of examples of art-science collaborations. Each artist takes a different approach in offering fresh insight into scientific concepts. They can bridge gaps in understanding and complement the value of what scientists and engineers do. It's not so common, however, to find artists and scientists working alongside each other, trying to understand and find solutions to a common problem. So I'd like to see more of that happening. I'm just going to talk briefly about a number of wetlands projects where artists are playing a role, and then present a short case study of another ongoing arts and science project I'm involved with. These cover a range of artist involvement and include those in which the artist initiates the art project, more organic partnership projects in which artists work in a team alongside other practitioners, sometimes as part of academic research. And then there are more formal arrangements where a lead organisation, usually from the land management or scientific side, appoints artists for a specific commission. So starting with Alison Lloyd, who's also a walking artist. In 2011, she selected an area of the Dark Peak in Derbyshire with large areas of blanket bog. She chose this place for its sense of remoteness rather than its ecology. The main focus at this time was on the photographic documentation of her walking as art. Through walking, she noticed that the land was being managed through tree planting on the edges of the cloughs and other changes. And the Moors of the Future partnership project has a well-established community engagement programme to raise public awareness of their work to restore upland peat bogs, based on a strong evidence base of scientific research and monitoring. So Alison Lloyd's art project, with a working title of Walking in Resistance, is self-initiated, supported by Arts Council funding. Lloyd's art methods and processes do not follow any strict scientific methodology that may be added to what is captured by the scientists, ecologists, conservationists, and all the skilled work undertaken by the contractors who plant sphagnum mosses, block the gullies, and construct heather brash dams to re-wet the blanket bog. She maintains a dialogue with project officers and conservationists who are happy to share information about their work. Wetland Life is a project exploring the ecological, economic, social and cultural values associated with wetlands in England to better understand how to manage change into the future. It's a public funded project under the Valuing Nature programme. It's an interdisciplinary project utilising a range of natural and social science research techniques, as well as approaches from the humanities and the arts, to understand some of these values of wetlands from both an historical and contemporary perspective. There's been a wide range of research and project outputs, including published books, economic analyses, community voice films and sound recordings, a photography essay by Tim Acott, and artist collaborations. 3 artists were commissioned in 2017, Victoria Leslie, researcher and published author, and Kerry Morrison, a socially engaged artist and interdisciplinary researcher, who's collaborating with sound artist Helmut Lemke. Their work merges art and ecology to produce intriguing interventions in the landscape. Over in Ireland, Loughborough and Turan were the first large raised dome bogs in the country where the peat was cut away effectively to exhaustion. It's also where experiments in reclamation and rehabilitation began. These bogs were amongst several in central Ireland where the extracted peat was supplied to peat-fueled power plants. Between 2002 and 2010, the site became an award-winning sculpture park where significant work was done on site. It was recognised for the quality of the work and the innovative nature of the partnership. However, beyond 2011, tensions emerged which are only recently being addressed. So this deep mapping research by Reiko and Tim Collins was published last year. It provides a wide-ranging and detailed review of how an integrated arts and ecology programme might be developed. There's far more in the report than we can possibly go into today, but I'd recommend it for further study as its relevance to many other wetlands and post-extraction landscapes. And then we have the Peatland Connections project, highlighting the significance of the Galloway peatlands in Scotland through a range of practical and community engagement initiatives. The project will work with the Carbon Landscape Partnership and Pendle Hill Landscape Partnership to align the peatland activities on a national scale. Peat Cultures was envisaged as a companion project and became a pilot for some aspects of the Peatland Connections projects. It comprised a suite of community engagement and artistic activities seeking to engage people to consider peatlands as valuable in their own right, as well as of wider significance for climate action and wildlife protection. Kate Foster is an environmental artist with an interdisciplinary and collaborative approach whose work engages with environmental issues. Since 2017, she's focused on wetlands. She developed a series of artworks for peat cultures inspired by the peat restoration techniques to tell the story of formation, degradation and repair. In September 2020, match funding from the Esme Fairbairn Foundation was granted, which has created the role of a part-time Peatland Connections project officer, who will develop a bottom-up collaborative approach by bringing together a wide range of stakeholders with arts and science to engage deeply with the themes of peatlands, climate change, sustainable land use, and natural capital. So onto Avon Meadows in Pershore, Worcestershire, where I'm one of 4 artists commissioned by Meadow Arts to make an artwork and to work with community groups responding to the seasons and changing environment in this wetland. Other artists are Melanie Woodhead, Kate Raggett, and Emma Plover. Meadow Arts is a contemporary art charity delivering ambitious and accessible projects in unexpected rural places. For this project, they're working with a floodplain Meadows partnership, which represents a number of key organisations and is hosted by the Open University. Species-rich floodplain meadows have become very rare in the UK. Historically, they've been significant for food production, provision of hay for feeding animals in winter, and as grazing for animals. They are highly fertile due to being nourished by the river silts during seasonal floods. And by managing the floodplains, the meadows evolve into wildflower grasslands. Wetlands are also important sites for birds, amphibians, and other wildlife. It's a combination of beauty and utility that's an overall theme for the art project. And it was this interdependent relationship between humans and more than humans that really interested me when considering the future for such places. The artwork I created relates to the themes of flooding and the meadow's role in natural flood attenuation of the river, alleviating peak flows downstream. I use quite a few different processes. So after collecting plants, berries, soil and other materials from Avon meadows, I use reeds and silver birch to make paper. And I made dyes and pigments to dye the paper. And as a hydrologist will hopefully recognise, the design is based on 2 hydrographs which illustrate how the floodplain storage has the effect of flattening the curve to lower the flood depth and delay the peak so the impact downstream may be lessened. As you can see, it's a highly textural piece. So, turning to the Mosses and Marshes project. It's an art project co-led by me and Kim Goldsmith in Australia, which questions how we think about and value natural environments through work centred on the raised peatbogs of Fenn's, Bettisfield and Whixall mosses, and the iconic Macquarie Marshes in New South Wales, Australia. The project links together places on opposite sides of the planet, and in doing so, draws attention to global environmental issues that we all share and must face up to. On the surface, these areas are vastly dissimilar. The landscape, the issues and management of the mosses and marshes all differ in response to their respective climatic and environmental conditions. However, both are natural wetlands of international significance and both have an impact on or are impacted by land uses. The interpretation of water data for both sites, along with access to them from field trips, provides an opportunity to present these spaces creatively through a new lens in a way not routinely experienced. This, in turn, gives managing bodies and those with an interest in the mosses and marshes a chance to put the spotlight on why they are so important and how they might be managed in future. So how did I get involved? I've been visiting the mosses in North Shropshire for a few years, and along with a group of other artists and writers, I was interested in making work in response to that landscape, which seemed to me to be quite a special place, seemingly not widely known or visited, even from within Shropshire and local areas. I was initially interested in the restoration of the former scrapyard, which we've heard about, and as I walked the landscape and learned more about the history of the mosses, I began making artworks and talking to organisations involved with a view to doing something longer term. And how did the connection with Australia come about? Well, for around 3 years, I'd been participant in Arts Territory Exchange programme, which is led by artist curator Gudrun Filipska. Arts Territory Exchange comprises a global network of artists and art practices which respond to the geography of their place of production. Artists are paired up to exchange works and ideas, and this enables an otherwise impossible dialogue between remote and disconnected practices. There's an accumulating library of artifacts and debate, which can be presented to a global audience in a range of different forms, not necessarily via the conventional format of a gallery space. In these times when the notions of cross-cultural exchange and interdependence face increased challenges, it's important to strengthen and publicise these global connections. It was through Arts Territory Exchange that I began discussing the possibility of a project with artist Kim Goldsmith. Kim is a digital media artist and producer with a strong background in media and marketing. She uses sound, video, and other technology to capture the natural environment. Her work is largely informed by the management of rural remote landscapes and natural resources of Western New South Wales. Kim and I use similar processes to explore sites, really getting to know both human and ecological perspectives by spending time there. It can be described as deep mapping. I use walking to lead my research into what can be detected by our human senses, and also into the historical layers associated with the site. Kim's focus is the use of technology to dig deeper into the landscape. We shared an interest in how land and water are managed, and this international dimension opened up entirely new creative possibilities for a project at the Mosses, which in turn attracted the interest of other stakeholders. So Kim and I spent over a year making field visits, gathering recordings and making research. In the UK, I'm working with Shropshire Wildlife Trust and Natural England, and Kim is working with the Macquarie Marshes, Macquarie Wetlands Association, and in contact with farmers, soil scientists and wildlife specialists. I was successful in securing a project grant from Arts Council for England towards the end of 2020, which will enable us to deliver a series of activities throughout 2021 in the UK. We also had a successful joint crowdfunder campaign for the Australian Cultural Fund, and Kim has secured further funding in Australia to support delivery of other community engagement and arts development activities. We launched a project with a short taster video on World Wetlands Day last month, and I won't risk the technologies and sound quality to show the video now, but you can find it in the link in the Q&A, or I think it's in the chat. And by engaging with the art project, we want people to be more curious about the natural environment, to feel more connected to nature and think about the relationship humans have with wetlands. We also want people to know about the values of wetlands in addressing climate change, biodiversity loss, water management, and in less tangible ways. We plan to make work with natural materials from the landscape and to find ways to reveal a landscape not ordinarily experienced and encourage people to notice nature in their everyday environment. So working with a landscape will help think about our own agency and impact and what that could mean for the future. So for Kim and myself, we'll be creating new artworks for public exhibition at Cube Gallery in Oswestry in October, where Gudrun Philipska will be curator. We'll be producing a project publication due for release prior to the first exhibition, and then Australian exhibitions local to the Macquarie Marshes and in Canberra will follow in 2022. And I'm also working with a team of other artists and advisors, including Media Active Projects, who have a long-standing relationship with the Mosses and Marshes Landscape Partnership Programme. And then the experience of Lydia Halcrow is proving invaluable in helping us develop and evaluate the project. Lydia is an artist using her walking body to make alternative maps of the landscape. She's a lecturer and tutor with Open College of Arts and PhD researcher and associate lecturer at Bath Schools of Art and Design. Artists Sue Chalice and Kate Johnson will work with me and with Shropshire Wildlife Trust to create site at the Mosses and at Wem Youth Club. Wem is a small town in North Shropshire, about 6 miles from Whixall Moss. We plan to adapt work for projects with local primary schools to be arranged by Shropshire Wildlife Trust. So we want to promote immersive exploring of nature wherever people might find it, allowing for unexpected encounters. So I'll be creating a self-guided virtual arts trail or sound walk to be installed at Whixall Moss in the summer. And Elizabeth Turner and Keith Ashford are creating temporary sculptures responding to the landscape and its history as visual waymarkers for the trail. Turner and Ashford have a collective site-based practice exploring man-made and natural landscapes through sculpture and video. Here they are testing out a prototype for one of the sculptures in which they've been looking at wood and metalwork measuring tools in connection with the moss. This work explores notions of how we measure landscape, viewing the near and far, control of the land as a blank canvas, and the disorientating effect you get when you walk across the vast expanse of the moss and lose sense of distance, direction, and time, wondering where the center of it is. Sound will be a key part of our work, looking for non-visual ways of experiencing the landscape. It enables us to bring sounds and voices from across the world into a new territory. I'm also looking into data sonification. That's turning the water monitoring data that I have been given access to by Natural England into a form of music. So far, it's proving a bit challenging to find a way to reveal the seasonal and annual data trends as distinctive sounds. Perhaps that's a result of the disrupted topography that Robert was talking about, but I'm hoping that this can be achieved. So what kind of sites are the Mosses and Marshes? I've already heard a lot about that this evening, so I won't say too much more, other than to point out some of the key characteristics that distinguish the site from the marshes. You say the moss formed about 9,000 years ago, after glaciers retreated, which can seem like deep time, but compared with more ancient landscape of the Macquarie Marshes towards the centre of Australia, it's relatively young. Plenty of time, though, for indigenous human knowledge to accumulate. To many visitors viewing this landscape for the first time, it could be mistaken for a wild landscape, relatively untouched by humans. It's rarely the case anywhere on the planet, and that holds true for both the Mosses and Marshes. So we know that people have visited or lived by the Mosses going back to Neolithic times and possibly earlier. In the 19th century, there were 3 separate findings of bog bodies at the Mosses, at least one of which was dated to the Neolithic period. The peat bog was likely a place for finding food, reeds, or other useful plant materials, to cut peat for fuel, and possibly as a spiritual place for making offerings. And then the settlements of Whixall and Bettisfield are included in the Domesday Book, which sets a different tone for how land was to be valued. Land that yielded no tax because it was uninhabited or uncultivated was termed waste. Wetlands such as the Mosses were commonly regarded as waste. As we move on into the Middle Ages, land around the Mosses was used for gathering wood, and then turbary licenses for cutting turf and peat began to be granted by the lord of the manor, who derived some income. And over time, the potential to accumulate income from the extraction of peat became of increasing interest to landowners. Parliamentary enclosures of Fenn's Moss and Whixall Moss between 1704 and 1826. And it was these enclosures that defined the pattern of fields, drains, footpaths and roads, which remain evident today. Commercial peat extraction didn't really begin until after 1851, by which time the canal connecting Ellesmere and Whitchurch had been built, and a railway followed in 1863, which significantly opened up links to the wider world. The military requisitioned Fenns and Whixall Moss for training during both World Wars, and there were rifle ranges and bomb testing sites. And in the Second World War, part of the site was used for the Starfish decoy site as an attempt to confuse German bombers heading for the industrial areas of Merseyside and Manchester. Peat extraction became more industrialised as the market for using peat in horticulture grew during the 1960s. Meanwhile, around the fringes of the moss, there is an aluminium works, and until recently, as we've heard, a car scrapyard. This narrative of developments on and around the Mosses over the last millennium is largely a tale of land ownership, requisition and control. Arguably, with the land under the custodianship of Natural England and conservation partners, for the first time in its history, the land is being managed in the interests of a global public. But how will these environmental needs be balanced with those of local farmers and communities to take account of a range of factors, including global warming, biodiversity loss, economics and public attitudes to landscape? So over the Macquarie Marshes, they cover about 200,000 hectares, including floodplain, so vastly larger in scale compared with the Mosses. And the fact that the wetland is a river floodplain is another major difference. The marshes were Ramsar listed due to being one of the largest remaining inland semi-permanent wetlands in the Murray-Darling Basin, and having a high diversity. What's happened there? High diversity of wetland types. There are several internationally threatened species on the IUCN Red List, and 3 nationally threatened species include the Australasian bittern, Australasian painted snipe, and Murray cod. Unlike the mosses, where public access to the National Nature Reserve is relatively unrestricted, the Macquarie Marshes are 90% privately owned, mostly for grazing land, and the 10% that is publicly managed by the New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife is not easy to gain access to. This aerial shot shows a Berrima site where King Goldsmith has been given access to make sound and video recordings for the project. The fertility of the marshes not only supports a diverse range of plants and animals, but also provides an iconic natural area with significant cultural values. Competing values is one of the biggest threats to the future of the marshes. Upstream irrigators and downstream graziers are both extractive water users, interested primarily in productivity. The local saying goes that fat ducks mean fat cattle, and environmental outcomes are tied to the politics of managing water for the Commonwealth. Indigenous rights associated with cultural values of the area are an afterthought. The Macquarie Marshes face some significant environmental threats, some of which are driven by global warming. And there are other contributing factors such as river regulation, causing alterations to natural flow regimes, dry land salinity, and channel erosion due to the regulated flows. Other issues include pest management and invasive species. Fire management is another issue, and we all saw the catastrophic bushfires that devastated much of Australia a couple of years ago. The marshes were severely affected, and studies are ongoing into the recovery of the landscape and its ecosystem. Fire is similarly a serious consideration at the mosses. I heard from former peatmen how in the past fire breaks were created by controlled fires. Sorry, this is wanting to jump ahead. Fire breaks were created by controlled fires, similar to how Australian Aboriginal people managed the land. This helped mitigate fires that used to occur, sometimes as a result of sparks from passing steam trains. So in her fieldwork, Kim has been making recordings in a range of situations that visitors would not normally get to experience. This includes underwater sounds of gases released by reeds, sap rising in trees, and nighttime sounds. So perhaps by revealing these hidden worlds, we can encourage even closer observation and an interest in learning more. So these are some of the themes Kim and I have explored. Art is not propaganda, and in the artwork that we are creating, we aren't necessarily trying to communicate a particular message. These themes may not always be evident in the work, but they are within our thinking and inform what we do. They'll be covered in the book we'll publish as part of the project. I try to remain open to challenging established narratives for a place if there are alternative stories that need to be heard. I've mentioned most of these topics already, but just want to focus on a couple of themes about the tone or language of the landscape and the human and more than human relationship. So each of the Mosses and Marshes landscapes have a particular set of vocabulary, language and sounds associated with them. Kim and I are combining work to create soundscapes reflecting this. I'm going to try playing this short taster video, which you can also find a link to in the chat. It's called The Tone of Things. It's a video and sound mix layering handmade paper made from the reeds of Whixall moss with underwater footage from the reed beds of the Macquarie Marshes, accompanied by tones generated in post-production from field recordings captured on both sites, atmospheric sounds from the wetlands, and hydroacoustics of water plants with their roots deep in the mud. So through our research, both Kim and I have recorded the voices of people from the local community. Capturing what might be considered a representative view from all the various groups associated with wetlands is an impossible task, fraught with problems. We are not attempting to do this, but we are trying to show that there are multiple diverse points of view, often within the same social groups. So I'm aware of my own presence or intervention into the fragile wetland landscape, and that I need to earn the trust of local communities who will no doubt see me as an outsider. For many people, the values they attribute to wetlands go beyond the measurable environmental or economic values. They talk about memories, links with historical events, community activities, friends they made, favorite trees, sensory experience, atmosphere, a place for solitude or reflection, time with their dog, dramatic weather, big skies, connections with the stars and the cosmos. There's an ongoing debate about how or if we can apply a value to natural capital, but how on earth would we begin to put a quantitative value to a sense of place? I had conversations with Bill Olmark and Barbara Clawley at Whixall Moss, both from families with several generations involved in peat cutting. Bill in particular has very detailed knowledge of the site, having worked as peat cutter and then later as part of the team at Natural England. It was very quickly evident in my conversation that they both have an intimate knowledge of, love and care for the landscape and its wildlife. Only by being with the landscape on a daily basis for many years could you build this holistic experience. They both lamented the changes in the community life that for many years, centuries even, was closely linked with the work on the land and with the seasons. Of course, this is a change not restricted only to peat bogs or wetlands, but is an issue for many rural landscapes. Is it a change that matters? And what is it replaced by? How can we rebuild a sense of ownership that means people feel co-participants in nature within a cohesive, sustainable community? Looking further at human impact on the landscape, as I said earlier, it was a car scrapyard that first captured my attention. It's quite a mind-boggling sight to see it, mounded high with crushed cars and mountains of tyres amongst an otherwise seemingly wild landscape. Technology, engineering and remediation schemes can clear up the environmental damage from past industries. But is it good enough to clear away this legacy without trace if we do not learn from it or take on some collective responsibility? It begs the question about how humans can learn to stay in the present and stay with the trouble, to quote Donna Haraway. Geary et al. Summarizes what I'm trying to say more eloquently, so I'll read this quote in full. Recognizing the importance of past economic and industrial practices, both negatively and positively, needs to sit somewhat uncomfortably with our modern aspiration to live in accommodation with Earth systems. Providing visual cues of what went on in these wetland spaces before their reconfigurement is critical in order to remind us of what the global North is responsible for, what humanity has gained and lost, and what more we could lose without more entrenched responses in support of sustainability. I gathered a multitude of artifacts from the scrapyard as archaeological finds. I went on to create a series of artworks, prints and paintings based on these human-made objects that I'll juxtapose with the more than human realm. Donna Haraway and Anat Singh both urge humans to make connections and work with more than human species. Singh says, collaboration means working across difference, which leads to contamination. Self-contained individuals are not transformed by encounter. The important stuff for life on Earth happens in those transformations, not in the decision trees of self-contained individuals. Singh also refers to how patterns of unintentional coordination develop in assemblages, and a need to notice patterns in the interplay of temporal rhythms and scales in divergent lifeways that gather. So in any ecosystem such as this, we can observe multi-species assemblages and learn to coexist. The polyphonic assemblage is the gathering of these rhythms as they result from world-making projects, human and not human. So few would argue that the environmental crises we face of climate change and biodiversity loss demand urgent action. We need to reverse the trend for wetlands being net carbon emitters to become vital carbon sinks. So the careful preservation or restoration of wetlands in projects of just the kind that Robert has spoken about are absolutely critical. However, the future management of these landscapes cannot be entirely isolated from the human and more than human worlds around them if that is to be sustainable. As more precious and vulnerable landscapes are given separate status or designated as nature reserves, then I see a potential for people to perceive that this is where a true or pure nature exists. And the nature that we see elsewhere in our everyday lives is seen as being tainted, less valued, less cared for, and open to be developed or exploited. So I believe it's imperative that humans maintain a closer relationship with the more than human realm, wherever that may be, especially in wetlands. There needs to be opportunities for communities local to wetland areas to rebuild that sense of ownership. The Mosses and Marshes project is not intended to present answers to these questions, but in drawing attention to the importance of wetlands, we hope to encourage wider debate about their future. Thank you for listening. And if you'd like to follow the progress of the project, then you can visit either of these websites or get in touch by email. These also have links to Kim's project work over in Australia. Okay, over to Dave.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was a tour de force, a very timely reference to Donna Haraway there as well. Lots of trouble to be staying with. And speaking of time, we've got a slight challenge there because technically we were supposed to terminate this webinar in about 1 minute. But I think if people are interested, we can perhaps stay for a little longer. And we should perhaps also acknowledge that Kim herself has joined us on the webinar. It must be very early in the morning where she is, I think. And Andrew, you've got a comment from Kim on your website where she says that collaborating with someone who works in a different way makes you think harder about what you do and why you do it. And I was wondering if that applies to the interactions between you and Robert, and whether each of you from your different disciplines thinks that being connected to each other through these projects has affected the way you think or the way you work or the way you look at the landscape, and if so, how? Maybe Robert, would you like to kind of make a comment on that?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I think the connection with Andrew is definitely starting to widen the view that we have around our sort of very much head down focus on sort of conventional conservation, and it's really refreshing to have that other insight, and I think, you know, just it's very complementary really, and yeah, it will sort of make us think very much about things about how we engage with the local community, etc.
And Andrew, I mean, you already have a background in environmental management, but is your arts practice influenced at all by the potential utility that it might have in the conservation objectives for these places?
I think it adds a little bit more rigor about thinking why it's relevant, and also is it authentic to me and to the project. You know, does it provide any more useful insight into what Robert's doing and what my personal response is, and then linking across to Australia. You know, there's a lot of different aspects which need to be considered, but it's providing quite a good focus to look at what Robert's doing and to question that and to see how it impacts with the people around it.
So a lot of what you've both touched on relates to how we might visualize the future, short-term, medium-term or long-term for this place. Obviously the restoration program is part of that. But there were some questions coming in during your talks about things like the potential influence of changes in weather patterns and the climate, but perhaps also changes in cultural attitudes and community involvement and public awareness of these things. I'm wondering, how far ahead are you thinking, and have you got a sort of evolving vision that's new as a result of some of this work about the future of this place?
Is that to me, Dave?
Sorry, yes, by all means, pick it up first, Robert.
Yeah, how far is our vision? Well, our bog restoration is a long-term business, so we're looking at decades to the end of the century. What we're trying to do is set and train the conditions that allows the bog to react and function as an ecosystem going forward. And what our aim is to have less and less human intervention in the future management. As you can see, what we've shown you there is a fairly radical intervention strategy for the short term, but the aim is long term that we have much more of a hands-off approach as far as we can as the bog heals itself. And in terms of the community engagement, it's really important side of what we've been trying to do, because you know, to be frank, the site becoming a nature reserve has not always been seen as a positive move by the local community. And we've worked, not myself, but colleagues before me have worked really hard to try and build links with that local community and start to change the way they see the site. And I think we're in a transition period where we have some of the community that see very much where we're coming from, and then there's also a sort of residual view, which is you know, perhaps it sees things in a different way. I don't know if Andrew wants to comment on that.
I don't know. I'm thinking that as history tells us, that the landscape is a very dynamic situation. It evolves, and it will evolve as climate change takes hold. The work that you will do, or what you are doing, will need to adapt, won't it? Because, you know, potentially could it become even drier, and so I don't know how that's going to affect your planning for future work. I guess you can only do what you can do. But I think, you know, as I keep referring to about staying with the trouble, we have to collectively be very attentive to how the site will evolve and how the landscape evolves and what we can do to live with that.
Are either of you gaining insights into how people in general can cultivate these capabilities of imagining the way it might be? I mean, I don't know, Andrew, whether you were speaking about some of the cultural history of both of you, about the cultural history of the place. Has there been any history of creative and artistic representations of the values and meanings of this place, or is that a relatively new phenomenon?
Well, I think there has been a number of different interpretations of it, and I've actually linked up with a poet, Gladys Mary Coles, who was involved right at the start of when it was it was 30 years this year, isn't it? It was a national nature reserve designation, and she wrote a series of poems called The Kingdom of Sphagnum, and she was the poet laureate of the Mosses, and achieved some acclaim to that. And I know that a number of other artists around have responded to the landscape, but I don't know whether that's gone much further than the local, very local communities.
Yes, I mean, there was a question in the Q&A, I think, about the prehistoric history of the place, and so I was thinking back across the centuries as to whether artistic representations or the aesthetic values, the spirit of the place represented in that way, has been a feature in the past, or is that just something quite recent?
I'm not aware of anything from my research much beyond the 20th century. Yeah.
And so, Robert, I referred just now to the phrase "spirit of place, which in some corners is being woven in now to the sort of policy agendas that previously were, if you like, purely sort of science-based. Do you see ways in which these sorts of intangible values can be addressed in the formal policy protections and management regimes for designated areas like this, alongside the tangible values of hydrology and wildlife?
Yeah, well, one aspect of the project which I didn't really get a chance to talk about was the engagement side, and our partner Shropshire Wildlife Trust are doing a lot of work to develop new interpretation materials about the site, which hopefully will capture that spirit of the place in a modern way. So it will be talking about climate change and the peatland, but also recognizing the way it was used in the past by the local communities, etc. So we very much want to celebrate that cultural heritage around this, and we've really tried to do that going forward. So, for example, we have one of our public access routes is called the History Trail, to celebrate the history of the site. So I don't know if that covers that one.
Yes, well, it was whether either of you saw prospects for ways of having those values defended and safeguarded in the same way as the ecological values are. You can promote them and communicate them, but if they're jeopardized, what's the management response to that?
Well, I can't really talk for the management response, but I had a meeting yesterday with Shropshire Wildlife Trust. Are very enthused by what we're doing, and the number of ideas which are evolving really about how community engagement can take place. And people are coming forward. For example, I've been speaking with local parish councils, and there are other resident groups across the border into Wales that are wanting to set up community projects, oral history projects. So this is beginning to snowball in a way, and I think people are really starting to look at the site in different ways, and to think how they can celebrate it and feel a bit more connected.
Excellent. But we have gone quite a bit over time, so I think we should start to draw this to a close. Maybe one final question for each of you would be just to ask what you are perhaps most curious to find out or experience about this place next. What are you looking forward to discovering or uncovering or deepening in your personal and professional relationship with the place?
Ooh.
Who wants to go first?
I guess from my point of view, I'm keen to see how it responds, obviously, to the works we've done, and look at it to know how it's going to be in 5 years' time, and whether we've achieved that goal of trying to restore some kind of it's not a natural function, but it's trying to replicate a natural function for aspects of the ecosystem.
We'll join you in that. Andrew, where does your curiosity take you next?
I suppose there are a couple of areas really. What Robert's talking or trying to establish is that, I won't say a rewilding, it's a wilding, because whatever Natural England do won't be how the moss came about in the first place, but it's a way of establishing something that's a sustainable ecosystem. So I'm interested in how that will re-establish itself, and how we're only going to, it's going to go way beyond our lifetimes, but we'll maybe start to see some indications of how the landscape will start to re-energize. And I suppose the other thing that I'm still very interested in is how the data the monitoring that is being gathered around the site, and how we can look at that. I've not seen the ammonia data before, but that's quite an interesting finding, isn't it? And whether there's a way that artists can look at that and engage public with it, because it's important work. And you know, the work that that Natural England are doing is, I won't say it's necessarily under threat, but it's not necessarily visible to the world at large, the public at large. And you know, maybe artists can help with that.
Great. Well, thank you. That's a hopeful way to end. I think we should end now. Thank you very much to everyone who's submitted questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to them all. We might find a way of perhaps following up on some of that after today. But thanks from me personally as well to you, Robert and Andrew. You've given us a really interesting session and lots of food for thought. And a thoroughly good example of what SciWem can do at its best. So I think I now pass back to Stefan for any final remarks before we close the meeting. Stefan?
Yes, yeah, thank you all three of you for your contribution. It's really fascinating and important work that you've all shared. And you know, I quite look forward to getting out and about when we can do so again, to hopefully see the mosses and marshes up close where possible. So all I've got to say to finish up is thank you to those who have stuck around right till the end there. This webinar has been brought to you by SciWem. So please visit sciwem.org if you'd like to find out more about what we do. If you've missed part of the webinar, subject to consent from the authors, that will be published online for you to catch up on. And yeah, a huge thank you to the panelists, and thank you all for attending. So have a good evening.
Thank you, Stefan.